Our second reading this morning is from 1 John, the third chapter. 1 John may well not be from the same hand as the person who wrote the Gospel of John, but it picks up many of the same themes and clearly is for the same community of faith. Listen for what the Spirit may say to us as we hear these words. See what love the Father has given us, that we should be called children of God. And that is what we are. The reason the world does not know us is that it did not know Him. Beloved, we are God's children now. What we will be has not yet been revealed. What we know is this: when He is revealed, we will be like Him, for we will see Him as He is. And all who have this hope in Him purify themselves, just as He is pure. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Some of you may be familiar with the writings of Kathleen Norris, who's authored books such as Amazing Grace, Dakota, A Spiritual Geography, and The Cloister Walk. That last one, The Cloister Walk, gets its name, at least in part, because Norris, who is a married Protestant, lives for 9 months as an oblate in a Benedictine monastery. And the book, The Cloister Walk, has a chapter entitled The War on Metaphor. And in that chapter, she describes attending an event that was for pastors, Protestant pastors, mostly Lutherans, where the poet Diane Glancy gave a poetry reading. And as a way of introduction, Glancy told the audience that she loved Christianity because, quote, it was a blood religion. Gasp of shock went up from the audience, writes Norris. And she goes on to tell how Glancy went on to say she had always appreciated Christianity, the Christian faith's relationship to words and the power words have to form the world we live in. But Norris worries that we Christians have lost our appreciation for the power of words, and especially for the power of metaphor. And I want to read you just a portion from this chapter, The War on Metaphor. She writes, "My experience with Diane Glancy and the clergy is one of many that confirm my suspicion that if you're looking for belief in the power of words to change things, to come alive, and to make a path for you to walk on, you're better off with poets these days than you are with Christians. It's ironic because the scriptures of the Christian canon are full of strange metaphors that create their own reality. The blood of the Lamb, the throne of grace, the sword of the Spirit. And among the names for Jesus is the Word and the Way. Poets believe in metaphor, and that alone sets them apart from many Christians, particularly people educated to be pastors and church workers. As one pastor of Spencer Memorial, and if you read the book, you know that that's the Presbyterian church where she attends. As one pastor of Spencer Memorial, by no means a conservative on theological or social issues, once said in a sermon, many Christians can no longer recognize that the most significant part of the first line of onward Christian soldiers marching as to war is the word as. And she continues that this metaphoric impoverishment strikes me as ironic, partly because I'm well aware, thanks to a friend who's a Hebrew scholar, that for all the military metaphors in the Old Testament, the command that Israel receives most often is to sing. I also know that the Benedictines have lived peaceably for 1,500 years with a rule that is full of terminology, imagery, and metaphors borrowed from the Roman army. Now, personally, I'm inclined to think that this metaphoric impoverishment, as Kathleen Norris calls it, extends to those terms child of God and children of God. In current usage, they're often little more than flowery ways of saying human being. Indeed, to suggest that not everyone is a child of God is to sound a little bit fundamentalist. I can appreciate why, especially to our metaphorically challenged and impoverished ears, where words simply impart information. To speak this way is to engage in the worst sort of exclusivism, where some people matter and some don't, where some have value and some don't. But child of God is not just a piece of information. It is not a pedestrian label. Now, it may be that some of our problem with child of God comes from another metaphor, or maybe the lack of understanding of another metaphor that has also been flattened and impoverished. And that is the metaphor of Son of God. Like child of God, this is often taken simply as statement, stripped of its metaphorical thickness. We hear Son of God as mere description of Jesus and his divinity, his divine nature. But the writers of the New Testament and their original audience, people steeped in the metaphor-rich history of Israel, heard more. Psalm 2 is what's known as a coronation psalm. It quite likely was used in ancient Israel when kings ascended to the throne. And in that psalm, God speaks and says, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." Similar language is used in the Old Testament to describe God's covenant with King David. "I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son." There's nothing here about biology or divine DNA. This is a statement of relationship, of intimacy, a claim of adoption on the ruler of Israel. And there are echoes of these Old Testament passages in the gospel accounts of Jesus when he is baptized and called God's Son. And indeed, part of the core of the Christian message is that in our relationship with Jesus, we too can participate in the intimacy and the relationship that he knows as Son of God. We too can be adopted and become a part of God's family. And it's not simply a statement of the humanity that we share with everyone. This is an invitation to something new, to something wonderful. As the Apostle Paul writes, "You have received a spirit of adoption. When we cry, 'Abba, Father,' it is that same Spirit bearing witness with our spirit that we are indeed children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ," says Paul. And when Paul writes those words to the Christians who are in Rome, he opens that letter to all God's beloved in Rome who are called to be saints. Saints. That's another word that has been flattened and impoverished over the years, used usually to describe super Christians. But Paul does not use the word that way. He does mean it as something special, though. He does use it to speak of something very special. The word that Paul writes means holy, sacred, consecrated, set apart for special use. And in this sense, it's not so different from being adopted. To be a saint is to be set aside by God for special purposes, marked by God as those who are called to share God's love in the world, to be Christ to the world. Saints and children of God. Those apply to each and every one of you here. You are not children of God because of biology or your human birth. You are a child of God because God loves you and chooses you. God adopts you into God's family. And you are not a saint because you have done so well, although I know many of you have done quite well. You are not saint, though, because you have done so well. You are a saint because Jesus has called you, has chosen you, has set you apart for the special purpose to learn the ways of God's household, and so to be his brothers and sisters, and so to be the channels through which God's love flows into the world. As children and as saints, we are invited to the Holy Feast. We are invited to the table. Here at the table, we join with the saints of past, present, and future. Here we are nurtured and nourished by God's grace, that embrace that has adopted us as beloved children. Here at this table, we are met by the risen one, who we now know is our brother. And here we are strengthened in the sure and certain hopes that as the risen one's brother, we are indeed joint heirs who share in his resurrection and in his new life. Come to the table, all you who are chosen, loved, adopted by God. Come to the table, all you saints, those who have been consecrated for holy purposes. Come to the table of grace. Come to feast upon God's grace. Come and join with the saints who have gone before you. The saints with whom we will join at the great banquet, the great party, the great feast that is yet to come. Thanks be to God.